The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song as Natalie Hayes pushed through the ICU doors at 11:27 p.m. Her left leg dragged slightly, just enough that the night shift charge nurse never looked up from her computer. Nobody ever looked up. That was the point. The limp was old news. 3 years at Seattle General, and the staff had stopped noticing it somewhere around month 4. A disability was background noise in a hospital. Everyone had something broken. Natalie's was just more visible than most. She moved through the unit with deliberate precision, her scrubs the color of pale sky before a storm. The supply cart rolled silently beneath her hands, scarred hands that didn't tremble, that had learned steadiness in places fluorescent lights never reached. She counted for bags like ammunition. Checked flow rates like she was inspecting a weapons system. Her movements were economical, measured, the physical grammar of someone who'd learned that wasted motion could cost lives. The antiseptic smell of the ICU wrapped around her like an old uniform. Familiar. Safe. The kind of safe that came from routine, from knowing exactly where every instrument sat, from understanding that chaos could be managed if you stayed calm enough. The monitors beat their steady rhythm, a dozen vital signs broadcasting through the unit like distant helicopter rotors. She heard them the way other people heard their heartbeat. Always there. Never quite silent. Dr. Ashford swept past her on rounds at 12:15 a.m., his shoes clicking against the tile floor in a rhythm that suggested importance. He was the kind of man whose presence announced itself before his body arrived. Tall, assured, moving with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no by an institution that needed him. His eyes passed over Natalie the way light passes through glass, present, but not really seeing. She was part of the infrastructure. Useful, invisible, interchangeable. She caught his gaze for just a moment as he walked, that fraction of a second where someone looks at you without actually registering what they're looking at. She saw his eyes drop to her leg. Saw the microscopic calculation happen behind his pupils. Disability. Weakness. The kind of nurse who wouldn't push back. The kind of nurse who'd accept whatever terms came her way because where else would she go? His face relaxed back into its default expression of mild superiority, and he continued past her without a word. Natalie didn't flinch. She returned to counting 4 bags. Numbers were easier than people. Numbers didn't judge. Numbers didn't assume. Numbers just were. The radio on the unit clerk's desk crackled to life at 1:34 a.m. The ambulance dispatcher's voice came through, clipped and efficient, Seattle General ICU, incoming trauma, ETA 8 minutes. Colonel James Morrison, 62, unconscious on scene, Glasgow coma scale 4. Classified personnel, direct admission. Natalie's hands stopped moving. The 4 bags she was holding stayed suspended in her grip. A full 3 seconds passed before she set it down on the cart with the precise care of someone handling something fragile. Colonel James Morrison. The name hung in the fluorescent air like shrapnel. Like something that had been buried deep and suddenly, violently excavated. She'd never met him in person. 3 years ago, when Jacob deployed with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines to Fallujah's Jolan district, Morrison was the company commander. The man who'd promised that her son's unit would come home. The man whose command decisions were supposed to mean something. The man she'd checked the casualty lists for on her phone at 3 a.m., scrolling with trembling fingers, praying his name wasn't in the alphabetical roster of the dead. Jacob had come home. Most of his unit had. The rest became the kind of absence that never fully disappears. The ICU began moving like a coordinated organism. Staff materialized at the ambulance bay. The trauma team assembled. Respiratory therapy pulled out the intubation equipment, laryngoscope, endotracheal tubes in multiple sizes, the ambu bag draped like a readiness ritual. Charge nurse barked assignments. Everyone moved with purpose. Everyone except Natalie, who remained at the supply cart, her hands resting on its metal edge. She could leave. Go check on the other patients. Make herself useful somewhere else. The professional thing was to stay out of the way. The smart thing was to keep her distance from anything that had already burned her once. The ambulance doors burst open. The paramedics wheeled Morrison in on a stretcher, and Natalie caught her first real glimpse of him. Grey hair. Lines around his eyes that suggested a man who'd seen things that couldn't be unseen. A forerunning in his left arm. His chest exposed for assessment, and there. The scars. A geometric pattern across his ribs and upper abdomen that she recognized instantly. Not surgical scars from any hospital she knew. These were precise, efficient lines that told a very specific story. Field thoracotomy. Combat medicine. The kind of cuts made when conventional surgery wasn't an option. The kind of cuts made in the field. The kind of cuts she'd made. She'd made those exact cuts in Tikrit. The stretcher rolled past her, and Morrison's unconscious face was turned toward her for just a moment. She could see the ridge of scar tissue along his jaw. Could see the tattoo on his left shoulder, the unit marking, the date, the names of 4 Marines. Names she knew. Names Jacob had known. Get him to Bay 3, the charge nurse called out. Start getting labs, type and cross, full trauma panel. Get neurology on standby. And somebody find out what hospital that field procedure was done at, because those scars don't match anything in his chart. The team moved. Morrison disappeared into Bay 3. The ICU resumed its organized, controlled crisis, and Natalie stood alone at the supply cart with her hands gripping the metal edge. She'd spent 3 years building a wall between Major Natalie Hayes and whoever this person was in pale blue scrubs. 3 years of silence. 3 years of lunchtime alone, of deflecting personal questions, of keeping her hand steady through codes without anyone asking why they never shook. 3 years of her son calling and her saying everything was fine, just fine, working nights, keeping busy, nothing to worry about. And now Morrison was in Bay 3 with scars that matched her memory, with a history that tangled with hers in ways that nobody at Seattle General could possibly understand. The pain wasn't fear. It was information. That's what they'd taught her at Kandahar Regional Medical Center. Pain is data. Pay attention to it. Use it. And the information her body was broadcasting right now was that the distance she'd tried to build between her old life and this one had just collapsed. She released the supply cart and walked toward Bay 3 with the same deliberate limp she'd cultivated for 3 years. Just another nurse. Just another person doing her job. Just another person who'd learned that the past doesn't stay buried, it just waits. It waits for the right moment, for the right face, for the right set of surgical scars, and then it rises up out of the dark and pulls you back under. The heart monitors beat their steady rhythm. The ventilators wheezed. The fluorescent lights hummed their song. And Natalie Hayes, who'd spent 1,095 nights being invisible, felt something crack open inside her chest. Something she'd spent 3 years convincing herself had died in the desert. She lingered outside Morrison's room longer than the vital signs warranted, clipboard held at chest level, eyes tracking the surgical scars visible above his hospital gown. 3 precise lines. Perfectly spaced. The kind of mark she'd seen only on Special Forces operators post-extraction, tracking devices removed in sterile field conditions by combat medics who knew exactly where to cut. The appendectomy notation in his chart said 2008. These scars looked recent. Fresh. 2, maybe 3 years old at most. Her fingers traced the edge of the file without opening it. That breach of protocol, reading a chart outside your assignment, felt small compared to what the scars were telling her. Morrison had been in Tikrit when Jacob's unit deployed. He'd been Jacob's commanding officer. And he'd promised her son he'd look her up if he ever made it stateside. Promised. The word sat in her chest like shrapnel lodged too deep to extract. The footsteps came from behind. Quick. Deliberate. She didn't turn, but she heard Dr. Ashford's breathing shift into something sharper, more calculated. He moved to her elbow, angled himself between her and the nurse's station, his body language making it clear this was not a casual observation. His eyes dropped to the Morrison file. That's not your patient, Hayes. His voice carried the practiced authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without explanation. She closed the chart with one smooth motion. Checking continuity for night shift. The lie came out steady. Professional. The same tone she'd perfected 3 years of using, a voice that apologized for taking up space. He took the file from her hands. Not requested. Took it. Dr. Mercer is handling the Colonel's case. Your concerns, if you have any, route through him. Not to you. Not to this chart. Understood. She nodded. Met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to show compliance, short enough to demonstrate deference. The chemistry between them was immediate and toxic. He needed to be obeyed, and she had spent 36 months perfecting the appearance of someone who accepted that arrangement without question. But that wasn't the worst part. The overhead speaker crackled at 3:16 p.m. the next afternoon. The ICU seemed to pause mid-breath, as if the fluorescent lights themselves held their buzzing for one suspended moment. Nurse Nightingale to Station 3. Nurse Nightingale, Station 3. The nickname landed like a blade. The snickers started before the announcement finished. 2 residents exchanged glances over a patient's chart. A younger nurse whispered something to her colleague, and both of them looked toward Natalie's station. The snicker rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water, spreading, deepening, impossible to stop. She continued documenting vital signs on the EKG printout, her handwriting unchanged, neat, precise, controlled. Her hands did not shake. Her jaw did not clench. But the silence in her chest, the part of her that remembered what it felt like to give orders, to have her commands followed without question, that part went very, very quiet. Ashford appeared at her elbow within minutes, his presence the physical equivalent of a closing fist. That's you, right? His smile was a weapon, honed and deliberate. Our little Florence Nightingale, so concerned with patient welfare she's reading files above her clearance. She kept her eyes on the monitor. I'm just doing my job, doctor. Exactly. He leaned closer. She caught the smell of his cologne, something expensive and cloying, the kind of scent designed to announce arrival. Your job is what I say it is. And right now, I'm saying your job does not include Morrison. Does not include curiosity. Does not include questions. Clear. Clear. One word. Breathed out like an apology. He nodded, satisfied, and walked away. But the momentum had shifted. The nickname spread through the hospital like infection through a wound. By evening shift, every resident called her Nightingale. Every intern smirked when she passed. The nickname itself wasn't cruel on the surface, it should have been complimentary, referential to the legend of Florence herself. But intent transformed it. Intent made it a chain. 2 days later, the parking lot assault came at the end of her shift. The rain had stopped an hour earlier, leaving the asphalt gleaming like a mirror reflecting nothing. Her car was parked 17 spaces down, and Ashford positioned himself between her exit and the hospital entrance, his posture casual but his timing too precise to be coincidence. He held a clipboard, the one containing staffing schedules. Hayes. Not a greeting. A summons. She stopped. Her left leg ached, it always did when the barometric pressure dropped, phantom pain from the shrapnel in Tikrit that the VA said would never fully resolve. She shifted her weight and waited. He gestured for her to come closer. She did. Her entire shift filed past them both in the parking lot, 8 nurses, for residents, 2 orderlies. Everyone who would care. Everyone who would remember. Effective immediately, you're transitioning to part-time status, he said, his voice pitched to carry, his tone suggesting this was both regrettable and necessary. Budget constraints, as you know. We'll need flexibility on the weekend shifts. No guarantees on continuity. He paused, let that land. You'll be rotated through all units. Whatever coverage we need. The words themselves were bureaucratic. Reasonable. But the delivery was vivisection, performed slowly enough that she felt each cut. A single tear traced her left cheek. Just one. Her vision blurred for exactly 1 second before her hands moved to wipe it away. The motion was mechanical. Practiced. Like muscle memory from a life she was supposed to have abandoned. She held his gaze while she did it. Did not break eye contact. Did not apologize. Did not retreat. When her face was dry again, she spoke, and her voice was flat in a way that made several of her colleagues stop walking. "I've survived worse than you, doctor." The statement hung in the parking lot air like a challenge that had no answer. Ashford's jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough that she saw the shift in his micro-expression from satisfaction to something sharper, something that recognized the possibility that his victory was incomplete. He had broken her job. He had humiliated her publicly. He had established dominance through every institutional mechanism available to him. But he had not broken her. She turned toward her car with quiet dignity, her limp more pronounced from the weight of the day, from the accumulated pain of the scars beneath her scrubs. The dog tag hidden in her locker, the one with a rank that was supposed to stay buried, suddenly felt heavier, as if it was pulling her backward toward a version of herself she couldn't acknowledge, not here, not in the parking lot of Seattle General Hospital where she was just a nurse. Just a quiet woman in pale blue scrubs. Just Nurse Nightingale. But that wasn't all. Not quite. Because that night, when she returned home to her small apartment in Raleigh, her phone rang at 11:34 p.m. The caller ID showed internal Seattle General. A voice she didn't recognize, male, clipped, military precision in every syllable, said only, "Is this Major Natalie Hayes?" Pause. "Your son Jacob sent me. Colonel Morrison needs to see you. Tonight. It's about Tikrit." Tuesday morning at 6:41 a.m., Colonel Morrison's eyes opened to the steady beep of the cardiac monitor, the slow-moving drip of lactated Ringer solution, the antiseptic smell of Seattle General's ICU pressing against every breath. His vision cleared in stages, ceiling tiles, fluorescent panels, the silhouette of a nurse moving through the dimmed room with practiced efficiency. That nurse was Natalie Hayes. She didn't look up from the 4 lines she was checking, her movements economical, her face the portrait of professional distance. 3 years of night shifts had taught her how to be invisible. This morning, invisibility was about to become impossible. Morrison's throat was raw from intubation, but his mind was sharp. Recognition came like a sniper round, sudden, precise, final. "You're Jacob Hayes' mother," he said, his voice a graveled whisper. "Major Hayes." The 4 line in Natalie's hand stilled. Just for a fraction of a second. The kind of hesitation that civilians don't notice, but military personnel recognize as the moment before everything changes. She didn't turn to face him. She finished checking the line, made a note on his chart, and then, only then, did she look at him directly. Her eyes were the color of winter sky, and they contained exactly nothing. "Your blood pressure is elevated, Colonel. I'm going to increase your pain medication." It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Morrison's lips curved into something that might have been a smile if his chest didn't scream with every small movement. He didn't press. Men who had survived what Morrison had survived understood when to stop talking. Natalie adjusted his fluids and left the room with the same unhurried pace she'd entered, but her left hand, the one with the faint white line of scarred tissue running from wrist to elbow, was trembling. Not from fear. From recognition. From the crushing weight of a secret about to detonate. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It changed the trajectory of 7 lives. Kozlov appeared in the ICU at 6:52 a.m., 15 feet from Morrison's door. He was 7 feet tall, 340 pounds of gristle and fury, with a face that looked like it had been reassembled by someone who'd never seen a human before. His titanium hip replacement, installed after a motorcycle accident in 2009 that should have killed him, was the only reason he'd cleared airport security in Seattle with an 8-inch carbon steel blade hidden in a custom-fitted shin holster. The metal detector had scanned right over the concealed weapon. Titanium hip registered. Blade did not. He'd walked through the front doors of Seattle General at 6:44 a.m. with a visitor's pass clipped to his jacket and murder on his mind. Colonel Morrison had testified against him for years ago. Kozlov had been running a militia cell out of a compound in rural Washington, and Morrison, then actively cleared for classified testimony, had given depositions that landed Kozlov 18 years in federal prison. The conviction had held for 3 years before his lawyers found a technicality, a procedural error in the evidence handling. Kozlov had walked free 6 weeks ago. The first thing he'd done was research every person involved in his prosecution. The second thing was drive to Seattle General and walk into the ICU like he belonged there. Natalie was checking the blood pressure cuff on bed 12 when movement caught her peripheral vision, massive, deliberate, wrong. The way a predator moves when it stopped pretending to be prey. She turned and saw him, flannel shirt, work boots, beard like burned steel wool, and eyes that had the flat, reptilian quality of someone who'd spent years in a cage thinking about revenge. He was heading directly toward Morrison's room. She moved without thinking. The first mistake civilians make is overthinking, and Natalie Hayes hadn't been a civilian for 23 years. She stepped into the hallway 4 feet in front of him, her small frame positioned between his bulk and the door, her voice pitched low and professional like she was addressing a confused patient rather than a 7-foot human made of violence. "Sir, you can't be here. This is restricted access. I'm going to need you to leave now." Kozlov didn't break stride. His presence made the air pressure change, made the fluorescent lights seem to hum with different intention. "Move, nurse." Behind the nurse's station, Dr. Ashford's head lifted. He was on his phone, already calling security, his finger moving to another contact even as he watched. This moment, this precise moment, was perfect for his narrative. A volatile situation escalating. An unauthorized security threat. And there was Natalie, about to be caught in the middle of something that would finally, conclusively prove her instability. His lips curved upward. Natalie didn't move. "This is a restricted medical area. You need to leave now. I can call someone to help you find the visitor's center." Kozlov tried to shoulder past her. 6 inches, maybe 7, would have been enough to move her. But Natalie planted her feet like she'd been bolted to the tile, and when he tried to force the issue, something in her posture changed. The submissive nurse disappeared. What emerged was something built for exactly this moment, compact, precise, and absolutely lethal. He grabbed her throat with one massive hand and lifted her off the ground. Her feet dangled 6 inches above the floor, and the ICU screamed in response, nurses shrieking, patients gasping, monitors accelerating into frantic rhythms. A crash cart rattled. Someone shouted security into the overhead paging system. Dr. Ashford's eyes gleamed with something darker than satisfaction. This was the moment his narrative came together perfectly. The nurse had escalated. She was aggressive. Unstable. She'd brought this violence into a critical care unit, and now he had witness after witness who would testify to her reckless behavior. What Ashford didn't see, what nobody in that ICU understood in the 37 seconds it took for everything to change, was that Natalie's hands had already moved. Muscle memory took over. Her hands moved with the precision of surgical instruments. She struck Kozlov's radial nerve with the heel of her hand, a targeted strike that made his grip spasm open involuntarily, his fingers spreading like a puppet's with cut strings. Her second movement was already in motion, a pivot on her good leg, using his own massive momentum against him. Tikrit had taught her that 7 feet of muscle and rage could be redirected like water. She swept his legs with her left leg, the one with the shrapnel scar underneath the scrubs, and despite the limp that made normal walking a negotiation with her own body, the movement was perfect. Kozlov crashed to the tile floor like a falling building, the impact hard enough to crack the air from his lungs. Before he could rise, before any security officer could round the corner, Natalie was on his spine with her knee driving down, distributing her weight through bone instead of muscle, maximizing pressure with minimal effort. She had his own blade in her hand, had stripped it from him in the same flowing motion that had taken him down, and the 8-inch carbon steel was pressed against his carotid artery with a steady, unwavering hand. "Don't move," she said. Her voice was calm. Conversational. The voice of someone giving a routine instruction to a patient: breathe. Relax. This will only take a moment. But underneath that composure was something else entirely. Something that had spent 23 years sleeping behind pale blue scrubs and was now, finally, awake. Security arrived 37 seconds later, 2 officers, then 4, then a supervisor with a radio crackling at his shoulder. They found Kozlov pinned with blood running from his temple where his skull had connected with the tile, his own blade at his throat, and a 40-something woman in rumpled scrubs with her knee in his back and her hand absolutely steady. "He's clear," Natalie said quietly, never moving, never wavering. Blade secured. No further threat. The officers moved in, fluid and professional, their own training recognizing the signs of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. They had Kozlov cuffed in 90 seconds, had him on his feet and being escorted out by hospital police and 2 Seattle PD officers who'd been called the moment the first alert went out. They were reading him his rights before anyone even thought to check if Natalie was injured. She wasn't. There were red marks on her throat already darkening toward bruises, but her breathing was steady, her hands were steady, and when she released the blade to the senior security officer, her grip was still controlled, precise, military. Dr. Ashford stood at the nurse's station with his phone still in his hand, watching the security footage replay on the monitor behind the desk. The sequence was automatic, every violent incident triggered camera review, and he'd known exactly where to look. He watched Natalie move. Watched her strike. Watched her execute what looked like a professional takedown with the efficiency of someone who'd done it before. Many times. His jaw tightened. His hand on the phone went white-knuckled. Every advantage he'd calculated, every narrative he'd carefully constructed, just evaporated like morning fog. He'd anticipated her breaking. He'd prepared for her shutting down, for her emotional instability to finally crack under pressure. What he hadn't anticipated was that the quiet nurse he'd been methodically destroying for the past 72 hours might be someone who could disarm a 7-foot violent offender with her bare hands. Security was already talking to her. Already praising her actions. The hospital director was being notified. Morrison, conscious now in his bed, watching the security footage on a tablet, was saying something about military protocol and witness protection and classified testimony. And Natalie Hayes, still in her rumpled scrubs with the emerging bruises on her neck looking like evidence of something far larger than a single ICU incident, was already thinking about her next shift, her next patient, the next 3 years of invisibility she'd planned to maintain. She had no idea it was already over. That everything, from this moment forward, was about to come into the light. She just returned to her station, made a note in Morrison's chart: patient stable. Vitals normalized. Incident occurred at 6:52 a.m. Threat neutralized, and continued her shift with the same quiet precision she'd maintained for 23 years. Behind the nurse's station, Dr. Ashford made 3 phone calls, one to the hospital director requesting that she review the security footage immediately, one to HR noting that potential unauthorized use of force, and one to his contact at the state licensing board. Each call was meticulous, professional, carefully worded to sound concerned rather than malicious. None of them would matter in the end. But he didn't know that yet. All he knew was that the game had just changed, and he was standing on the wrong side of a line he'd finally, fatally crossed. The ICU erupted in chaos the moment the police secured Kozlov's wrists with zip ties. Officers moved through the unit like sharks through murky water, their radios crackling with codes and timestamps that meant nothing to the nurses frozen in doorways. One detective filled out an incident report on a clipboard, asking Colonel Morrison questions he answered in a voice that didn't shake, hadn't shaken, not once, even when Natalie had him pinned against the linoleum. Security footage would be pulled. Statements would be filed. The hospital's legal team was already being notified. It was the kind of chaos that should have made Natalie invisible. Instead, it made her the most visible person in the building. Dr. Ashford watched the security footage in the privacy of his office at 3:51 a.m., alone except for the hiss of the air conditioning and the soft click of the mouse as he rewound the footage frame by frame. The moment Kozlov's hand closed around Natalie's throat. The precise angle of her elbow strike to his radial nerve, textbook disarming technique, the kind of precision that came from thousands of hours of training, not from a continuing education course on de-escalation. Her hands moved with terrifying fluid efficiency as she drove his momentum into a takedown, the blade ending up at his carotid artery, her knee planted on his chest, her breathing unchanged. She didn't gasp. Didn't tremble. Didn't hesitate. Her eyes were flat and grey as winter sky, and in them was something that made Ashford's stomach drop like a stone into dark water. Muscle memory. Combat conditioning. Military. The doctor sat back in his leather chair and steepled his fingers. He'd spent 37 years building his reputation at Seattle General, climbing from resident to chief of medicine, accumulating the kind of institutional power that came from knowing which board members owed him favors, which pharmaceutical representatives needed his approval for their latest drugs, which administrators couldn't survive a single phone call from him. But power meant nothing if someone beneath him harbored a secret that could unravel everything. A nurse with combat training. A nurse who'd just demonstrated lethal capability in his ICU. A nurse who clearly had knowledge, classified knowledge, military knowledge, about Colonel Morrison that went far beyond what any hospital staff member should possess. He picked up his desk phone at 4:12 a.m., the kind of phone with a physical line that couldn't be traced digitally. First call to Dr. Patricia Chen, the hospital director. Patricia, we have an incident report to file. Nurse Hayes engaged in unauthorized use of force against a visitor. Assault, technically. I'm concerned about her psychological stability and her apparent familiarity with classified matters related to a patient. I'm recommending immediate termination and a full investigation into her conduct. His voice was calm, reasonable, the voice of a concerned colleague. Chen would hear the words and see the logic. The violence. The boundary violations. The patient confidentiality breach. By the time Natalie clocked in at 7 that evening, the decision would already be made. Second call to Human Resources at 4:18 a.m. This is Dr. Ashford. Nurse Hayes needs to be terminated immediately. She's demonstrated unsafe behavior, compromised patient confidentiality by discussing classified elements of a patient's background, and assaulted a visitor without justification. I have documentation of her repeatedly accessing Colonel Morrison's medical file after his admission. This is a liability issue. The HR director would pull her file. Would see the 3 years of perfect evaluations. Would hesitate. But would ultimately defer to the chief of medicine. The liability was too great. The risk too real. Third call, at 4:31 a.m., to a contact at the state licensing board. I'm filing a complaint regarding Nurse Hayes' psychological fitness for duty. She demonstrated concerning levels of aggression today and appears to have undisclosed security clearances related to a patient. I'm concerned about her judgment and stability. You may want to open an inquiry. The words were chosen with surgical precision. Psychological fitness. Undisclosed security clearances. Stability. Not accusations. Just questions. Just concerns. The kind of concerns that would trigger a board investigation that could suspend her license for 6 months pending review. Natalie sat in the HR office at 2:19 p.m. the next day, and didn't blink as they told her she was terminated effective immediately. The folder slid across the desk contained photographs from the security footage, her hand striking Kozlov's arm, her body moving through the takedown, her expression cold as a bunker. Excessive force, the HR director said quietly, a woman named Sandra who'd always seemed kind until today. We understand you were protecting a patient, but the hospital has liability concerns. We need to let you go. Natalie's hands rested in her lap, one on top of the other, perfectly still. The dog tag beneath her scrubs burned like a coal against her sternum. She could feel its weight. Could feel the names engraved on the back, the 3 soldiers who hadn't come home from Tikrit, whose faces she'd held in her hands as their blood soaked through her gloves in a field hospital with no roof and no walls and only her hands between them and death. I understand, Natalie said quietly. You can collect your personal items from your locker. Security will escort you from the building. Your final paycheck will be mailed to your address on file. We'll be forwarding documentation to the state licensing board. Natalie nodded once. Stood. Walked to the door with her spine straight and her breathing even. Behind her, she heard Sandra exhale like she'd been holding her breath. By the time she reached the locker room, the news had already spread. The quiet night nurse had been fired, terminated, walked out by security. The nurses she'd worked beside for 3 years wouldn't meet her eyes. One of them, Marcus from the surgical floor, whispered "I'm sorry" as she passed, but she didn't acknowledge it. Acknowledgement was a luxury for people who got to keep their jobs. Her locker held the small geography of her hidden life, her personal stethoscope with initials scratched into the cold steel, a photograph of Jacob in his dress blues taken before his first deployment, a single pair of trauma shears with an engraved call sign on the handle that she'd carried since her last field assignment. She gathered these items into a canvas bag, each movement deliberate and controlled. Her hand trembled exactly 0 times. Her vision remained clear. Her jaw was locked, but her breathing stayed measured and deep. The hospital laundry occupied a basement corner with industrial washers that hummed like distant helicopters. Fluorescent lights cast everything in shades of pale green. Natalie approached the return counter where Mrs. Chen, the attendant who'd worked there for 30 years, looked up from her sorting. "I'm returning my scrubs," Natalie said. Mrs. Chen's eyes widened slightly. Word traveled fast. "Oh honey, I heard what happened. That's not right. That man had a knife." "Just returning my scrubs," Natalie said. She pulled each piece from the pile. The scrub top first, pale blue from 3 years of washing. She folded it with creases sharp as knife blades, accordion fold for the arms, 3 folds lengthwise, 1 fold at the bottom, then a final military hospital corner that left the fabric as rigid as plywood. The matching pants received the same treatment, each crease a precision strike, each fold executed with the same exactitude she'd once used on her dress uniform before inspections that mattered. Officer dress blues. Dress whites. All of it folded away, stored in duffels, left behind when the medical discharge came through and the army told her she wasn't deployable anymore because shrapnel in your femur means you limp, means you can't run, means you're no longer combat effective. "You're a good nurse, honey," Mrs. Chen said softly, watching the folding ritual. Natalie didn't respond. Couldn't. Her throat had closed around something that felt like swallowed glass. This was the final humiliation, not the firing, not the accusations, not Dr. Ashford's calculated phone calls. This was the moment where everything she'd rebuilt after the discharge, after the nightmares, after losing the uniform and the rank and the unit and the only identity that had ever made sense, was being folded away into a laundry bin like it had never mattered. Like she had never mattered. The dog tag burned beneath her scrubs. The room went so quiet you could hear the industrial washers in the adjacent room running their endless cycles, water and detergent and heat, washing away evidence of bodies and blood and illness. She finished folding the last piece of pale blue fabric and set it gently in the bin with the others. 7 hours ago she'd put these on. Now they were gone. Now she was gone. "What will you do now?" Mrs. Chen asked, her voice gentle as a nurse's voice addressing pain. Natalie picked up her canvas bag containing the only pieces of her military life she'd been allowed to keep. The photograph of Jacob. The stethoscope. The trauma shears. And beneath her now civilian clothing, still hidden, the single dog tag on a broken chain. "I don't know," she said. But she was lying. She did know. She just didn't have the words yet. The kind of words that would require speaking like a major again instead of like a nurse. The kind of words that would shatter the careful architecture of invisibility she'd been building for 3 years. Those words were coming. She could feel them gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. But not yet. Not until the hospital helipad began to shake. The Black Hawk touched down at 0700 hours, and the entire hospital felt it. The rotor wash shook the windows on the 4th floor, a sound that doesn't belong in a place designed for healing. Nurses froze mid-stride. A resident dropped a tablet. The cardiac monitor in room for 12 alarmed, though nobody had touched it. Through the ICU corridor windows, staff watched the aircraft settle onto the helipad with the precision of a predator landing on prey, its rotors still turning, blowing rain sideways across the tarmac. 2 men emerged from the Black Hawk in full combat gear, tactical vests, helmets, rifles slung across their chests with the casual competence of operators who'd worn them in places most people only read about. They moved through Seattle General like they owned it, their boots echoing on the tile in a rhythm that made everyone step aside without being asked. One of them walked straight past Dr. Ashford's office. The doctor was inside, reviewing discharge papers, when he heard the footsteps stop. When he looked up, the operator was in his doorway, eyes like chips of flint, voice like a tank idling in a garage. "We're looking for Major Natalie Hayes." Not asking. Stating. Ashford's pen dropped. It clattered on his desk and rolled across the floor, coming to rest against his shoe. He didn't pick it up. His face drained of color the way a sink empties, fast and complete, leaving only pale shock behind. His voice cracked. "She doesn't work here anymore. Not as of yesterday." The second operator pulled out a satellite phone. Made a call in a language Ashford didn't recognize. Nodded once. "Then we'll find her ourselves," he said, and they turned and walked toward the ICU without waiting for directions. The hospital's IT specialist, Marcus Webb, a radiology tech with a faded Army combat medical badge on his lanyard and 18 years of active service in his background, was standing near the monitor station. He watched the operators move. He recognized the bearing. He knew what SEALs looked like when they moved with purpose. He picked up his radio and contacted security, let them through. All access areas. Code, Blue Star. Colonel Morrison was standing in the ICU corridor, trembling on legs that were still learning how to hold his weight, when the operators found Natalie. He was pale as the hospital walls, dressed in a patient gown and a borrowed robe, supported by a physical therapist who'd wheeled him down for his first supervised walk. Morrison's eyes went wide. Not at the operators. At her. Natalie stood at the medication station, entering discharge notes into the computer. She didn't look up until Morrison spoke her name. Not as a nurse. Not as Natalie. As something else entirely. "Major Hayes," he said. His voice shook. "My son told me what you did in Tikrit. He told me everything. You saved his entire unit." Morrison's hands trembled against the walker frame. "You held that position when everyone else ran. 3 weeks ago, Jacob called me from Fort Carson. He said, 'Sir, I just found out where she is. She's pushing a medication cart in a hospital like she didn't earn a Silver Star.'" Natalie's hand stilled on the keyboard. She didn't turn around. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a sound like the ambient hum of her entire civilian life about to shatter. When she finally did turn, her eyes were level. Not tearful. Not surprised. Simply present. The way someone looks at a moment they've been waiting for, the way a soldier regards an order she's ready to execute. The next voice through the ICU doors was Dr. Chen, the hospital director. She was moving fast, and she wasn't alone. 2 figures in dark suits flanked her, FBI, their badges visible, their presence carrying the weight of federal authority. They were followed by representatives from the state medical board, 2 women in charcoal blazers carrying sealed folders. And behind them all, rolling a cart with a single hard drive sitting on top, was Marcus Webb. Dr. Chen's face was ash. She held Natalie's personnel file in her hands, and her fingers were shaking. "I just opened this file," she said, her voice steady but dangerous. "The redacted sections. They've been declassified. As of this morning." She opened the folder, and even from a distance, Natalie could see the photographs. Her in uniform. Her with commendations. Her actual service record, no longer hidden beneath pale blue scrubs. The SEAL team leader stepped forward. His voice filled the corridor like an order being given in formation. "Major Natalie Hayes. Silver Star. He paused. Every person in the ICU stopped breathing. 2 bronze stars with Vela device. Another pause. The weight of each word settled on the hospital floor like ammunition being counted. Purple Heart, awarded for wound sustained while holding a field hospital under siege for 14 hours against overwhelming odds. He looked directly at Dr. Ashford, who'd emerged from his office with his face the color of old parchment. She did that while you were still in medical school, Dr. Ashford. Marcus Webb stepped forward and placed the hard drive on the medication station next to Natalie. I recovered every file, he said quietly. His voice carried the tone of someone who'd already made peace with his decision. Security footage from the supply closet. The parking lot. The moment you fired her in front of the entire shift. He turned to the FBI agents. And the deleted emails. Every message he sent to HR, to the state licensing board, to his contact who helped him access Colonel Morrison's classified medical records without authorization. One of the FBI agents opened his leather folder. He looked at Ashford the way a prosecutor regards evidence that doesn't require a trial. You access sealed military medical files without authorization, the agent said. You retaliated against a protected witness. You fabricated patient safety concerns to terminate a decorated combat veteran. And you attempted to destroy evidence of a federal crime. He closed the folder with a sound like a coffin lid. Your medical license is suspended effective immediately pending criminal investigation. Do not attempt to practice medicine in any jurisdiction. Do not destroy evidence. Do not attempt to contact witnesses. Dr. Chen raised her hand, silencing the words Ashford was beginning to formulate. His mouth stayed open but no sound came out. She looked at him the way one looks at something that's already dead but hasn't stopped moving yet. You're suspended immediately, she said. Security will escort you from the building. Your office will be emptied by noon. Our legal department will be sending you notification of the hospital's intent to file a countersuit for damages. By that evening, Ashford's wife had served him with divorce papers. By the next morning, his malpractice insurance had dropped him. No hospital in the state would hire him. The physician networks that had taken his calls for 15 years suddenly couldn't find his number anymore. The colleagues he'd called allies returned his messages with voicemails from secretaries. Dr. Sterling is not taking calls. Dr. Bennett is with a patient. By week's end, his medical license was formally revoked. 6 months later, Natalie walked through Seattle General's ICU in pale blue scrubs that finally fit her the way they should. Her single dog tag hung openly around her neck now, glinting under the lights, no longer hidden beneath layers of concealment. She'd been reinstated with full back pay, promoted to ICU clinical supervisor, and given a formal apology from the hospital board, along with an anonymous donation to the military veterans charity of her choice, $847,000, from the hospital's malpractice settlement with Ashford. Colonel Morrison had returned to active duty, fully recovered, his medical discharge rescinded. But not before he'd ensured his son Jacob got stateside assignment so he could finally see his mother without 12-hour flights and 30-day leaves. They were having dinner tomorrow night. Jacob had requested her famous lasagna, the one she'd made every Sunday for 18 years. Through the break room window, Natalie paused to watch the strip mall parking lot across the street. Dr. Ashford sat alone at a folding table positioned between a cell phone repair kiosk and a tax preparation service. He wore a cheap polyester tie and a name tag that read Sales Associate. In front of him, glossy brochures for supplemental insurance policies were arranged in neat stacks, something to do with his hands, something to make it look like he hadn't been sitting there for 7 hours waiting for a customer who wasn't coming. A woman walked past his table without making eye contact. Ashford stood, tried to hand her a brochure, watched her keep walking. He sat back down, alone, and checked his phone for the 100th time that day. Waiting for calls that would never come. Marcus Webb appeared beside Natalie with 2 cups of coffee, following her gaze out into the parking lot. He'd been reassigned to the ICU as the medical records specialist, a quiet veteran who'd earned his field wings the hard way and never forgot what it meant to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves. Rough fall from grace, he observed, handing her a cup. She accepted it. Watched Ashford fold a brochure into smaller and smaller triangles, a nervous habit, a gesture of the profoundly powerless. He made his choices, she said quietly. Her voice had changed in the past 6 months. Lower. Stronger. The voice of someone no longer pretending. Now he gets to live with them. A young resident approached nervously, a fresh MD from Johns Hopkins, pale and uncertain the way new doctors are before they've seen enough to understand what they're actually looking at. Major Hayes? We have an incoming trauma. Military personnel. Ground-to-air explosive device, Kandahar province. ETA 3 minutes. The family is asking for you specifically. Natalie nodded, set down her coffee on the counter, her limp still visible when she moved but her shoulders squared in a way that suggested the limp was just biology, it had never affected her actual strength. She moved toward the trauma bay, and as she passed a young nurse who was standing frozen, staring at the dog tag, she paused. Met her gaze steadily. The nurse couldn't have been more than 22, fresh enough that she still believed nursing was just about following protocols. True class is what you do when the lights go out, Natalie said quietly. She continued down the hall without waiting for a response. The young nurse nodded, understanding washing over her face like dawn breaking. She picked up her phone and texted her mother, I just met a real hero. She was wearing scrubs. Across the street, Dr. Ashford folded up his table in the fading light, alone, while Natalie moved through the ICU with the purpose of someone who'd finally stopped pretending to be smaller than she actually was. The trauma alert sounded. The team assembled. And Major Natalie Hayes did what she'd always been meant to do, she saved lives in the dark, without needing anyone to watch, without needing anyone to know. If you made it this far, you understand something most people never learn, the quietest person in the room might be holding everything together. If you see someone like Natalie Hayes, someone carrying invisible weight, someone moving through the world smaller than they actually are, you might be standing next to a legend. Subscribe for more stories about the heroes we don't recognize until the moment we desperately need them.